for quite some time now, since the beginning of September, and we're halfway through, pretty close to it, and a little over halfway now. But really, I say this every week, but Exodus really, really excites me. And the more I get to spend time in God's book, and specifically in Exodus, the more excited I get. It's really just neat how everything that we understand to be true about theology, about God, about the Bible, is found in this book. And it really has become one of my favorite books. Before I became your pastor, it wasn't that I didn't like the Old Testament. It was that I didn't spend a ton of time in the Old Testament, really because I love theology, and not that there's not theology in the Old Testament, but the misconception is that the New Testament is where we get our theology from. And though much of our theology comes from Paul's epistles and things of that nature, the Old Testament's full of it as well. And so I really thought I would spend most of my time in the first couple years with you in the New Testament. And actually, I've only preached through one New Testament book. Two New Testament books. And the rest of my time has been spent in the Old Testament. And it's because God is really teaching me something. God is really using the Old Testament to bring to light some of the things that I know to be true in the New. And so it is just exciting to be able to preach God's Word and go through this every week. God always brings out something neat when I study each week, and that is really the cool thing about being a pastor that I get to do each week is, and you get to do it as well. Even you get to be in God's Word each week. We all have the same book, right? And but just being able to see the things that God reveals each week as I study through these things, and it really sometimes can be very devotional. Sometimes when you're preparing a message, I was telling the men at men's breakfast this week, it can at times be like work, right? Because some texts involve a whole lot more work, but there's other texts that can be very devotional. And this week, believe it or not, as I just read that text to you earlier on in the service this morning, this text was very devotional for me this week. And though you may think, how on earth can just a bunch of laws be devotional? Well, let me explain to you that these laws that were given really just show us who our God is. And when we read God's Word, that's what we should be doing anyways, right? God's Word is just a character card or a baseball card, so to speak, of who our God is. And that's what we get when we read these laws, is it reveals more about God to us. And so that's kind of what we're going to get at this morning. But just to kind of recap of what we've been talking about previously, because it's been about 3 weeks since we've been together. But a few weeks ago, we discussed Israel's purpose, right? Israel had been enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. God had brought them out of Egypt through his servant Moses, and the plagues he enacted upon Egypt. And so he brings them out, and they're wandering in the desert. They cross the Red Sea. All of these things have happened. God provides manna and water, and Israel's being taken care of, but they've been complaining all the way around, and they've kind of just been wandering without a purpose. And God, in chapter 18 and 19 and 20, he gives them a purpose. And he tells them this. He says, "Obey my voice and keep my covenant, and you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." That was Israel's purpose, was to obey God, keep his voice, or obey his voice, keep his commandment, and that then in return, God says, "You will be my treasured possession, a holy nation, and you will be mine." And so they were to obey and to keep his commandments, to be a kingdom of priests, to display his great name for the Gentile people. That was, or to the Gentile people rather, that was their purpose. Was simple put, obey my voice and keep my commandment, so that you may display my name to the nations. And then we got to the Ten Commandments, an often remembered or memorized passage, and we discussed what the purpose for them were to the New Testament church. Right, the old saints, the Israelites, right? The Ten Commandments were given to them for strict adherence. They were to follow those rules to display the character of God to the Gentiles. The difference for us today is that we display the character of God by following after Christ and displaying His love to the nations. Christ came to fulfill the law, and He did so by displaying His love on the cross. In Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, it says, "Owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbors as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law." So what do we as New Testament believers do? We are to love God and love others, and in so doing you fulfill the law. John chapter 15 says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends, if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, He may give it to you. These things I command to you, that you love one another." Love is the fulfillment of the law. That said, the law is not thrown out. We are to still see it as it is, God's written word. We are not to disregard it. There's still principles there to be taught and to learn from. And we fulfill it by loving God and loving others. The law is there for us to see our need for Jesus. That's what the law is there for. It's there to show us our sins so that we see the need for Jesus, so that He then can empower us to accomplish the love that we are called to do. And so this morning's message is going to be going through the next few chapters, chapters 21, 22, and 23. And we're going to look at each of those specific laws that Jesus lays out. Now you say, "Pastor, we're going to look at every single one of those laws. We're going to be here till next kingdom come." Well, we might be. But we're going to go through each of those laws, and we are going to see that these laws that He gives are not just new laws. These laws pretty much expound on the 10 laws that He's already given back in chapter 20. And you'll see that as we go along. And these laws are like the 10 Commandments, were to show the character of God and what He values. When we read through God's Word, we begin to see who God is. And as we begin to see who God is, we begin to see what God values. Just very similar is when we go through an election cycle and we see politicians come out and they start to make their platforms known, they start to make their policies known, and as we get to know them a little bit more, we start to see where their values lie and make a decision based off of that, or at least we should. And so as we read through God's Word, we see and begin to understand who God is and begin to see what God values. And that's why I've entitled the message this morning, "God Values, ... Because our main idea of our passage this morning is when we value what God values, we are glorifying God and loving others. And we cannot glorify God and love others if we do not value what God values. And so therefore, we ought to be able to read these 3 chapters of all of these laws and be able to find something out about God that He values, so that then we can align our values with His values and therefore glorify God and love others. And so the goal of our time this morning is to identify each of these laws in the day of the Israelite and see how we can apply the principles given to our Christian walk today as we seek to glorify God and love others. So let's go ahead and open in a word of prayer, and then we'll get into our text this morning. Father, we come to you this morning humbly, asking that you would teach us some truths of your word, Lord, that it might be applied to our lives, that we might serve you better. Lord, we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So throughout the book of Exodus, God has declared himself to be the God that is alone worthy to be worshiped. Now, Moses understood this. Moses understood this from the day that Moses was called. He didn't quite understand why God was calling him, but he understood God to be the God that is the God and the God that is alone worthy of his worship. It seems as though the people that Moses led, the Israelites, understood this idea in spurts. Much, I think, like the Christian at times, right? You see, Moses had encountered God. Moses knew God personally. The people, up until the previous couple chapters, had not encountered God. So when God came down to speak with Moses in front of all the people of Israel, this is the first time that they had encountered Yahweh. And so as God begins to hand down these civil and ceremonial laws, they're called, he begins by telling Moses to tell the people this. If you look at verse 22, he says, "Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, you have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven." Meaning, I have now showed you who I am, and as a result, you now know who you ought to be serving and who you ought to be worshiping. If you had any question in your mind at all who to worship and who to serve, you don't now, because I just showed myself to you. And so since I'm the one that worthy of such, here is how you are to do that. I'm going to show you what it is that I value most. Not me, but God. And so this is where we'll begin to dissect these laws and see what it is that God values most. I believe there's 6 of these that I've kind of sectioned out to kind of make it into an outline a little bit here. And so the laws that I'm going to mention here, each of them I've kind of sectioned out into a different topic, and each of those topics have various laws within them, and I believe there's 6 of them. And so the laws pertaining to God begins with the laws pertaining to worship. Okay, in verses 23 to 26, if you look at 23 to 26 with me, he begins by saying, "You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. An altar of earth we shall make for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you shall make an altar of stone, you shall not build it out of hewn stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, and your nakedness be exposed on it." So the first 2 of these sections is where we're going to spend the most of our time, because this is where God spends most of his emphasis. And I believe God put these in order on purpose, right? He didn't just throw all of these together. This is the purpose, and this is the order in which God wanted it, and so this is how we're going to structure it. So the laws pertaining to worship. He begins by explaining how they are to worship. And he does this because of the amount of pagan worship the Israelites had encountered as their time in Egypt. And so he begins by telling them how they are to worship. He wants them to worship significantly different than the rest of the pagan worshipers, okay? He wants them to make it about him. Not about themselves, not about the display, not about the show, but about God and God alone. And so these particular laws have to do with the first 4 of the 10 commandments pertaining to worshiping God alone and loving God alone, nobody and nothing else. And so in verse 23, "You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourself gods of gold." So many pagan gods were erected by precious metals or other type of precious materials or natural resources. God says this should not happen. It was believed by many that their gods actually reside within the image itself. So a pagan worshiper would erect this god out of some type of precious metal, and they believed that the god actually resided within that thing, within that item that they created out of that metal. And God says, I don't want you to make an image of me out of any type of metal. In fact, in verse 24, he then tells them that they are to make an altar out of the earth. This is probably implying that they were to make an altar from sun-dried mud. So they would make this altar out of mud, and then they would allow it to dry, and it would be just a simple altar that they would make their sacrifices on. We'll get to in a second. And then it was probably, not probably, we know it to be a desert area, and so there probably wasn't many rocks to begin with, and so God tells them, take the mud of the ground and make an altar out of that. He then says in verse 25, though, but if you are to use stone, so he wasn't ruling stone out, but he's saying if you are to use stone, use earth, but if you are to use stone, this is the way you are to do it. You are not to use finished stone. That's what he means by when he says in verse 25, not to use hewn stone, because what pagan worshipers would do, and we see a lot of this in some of our architecture today or even thousands of years ago, right? We see some of the pyramids and different things that they were made, was made out of stone that they would finish. And so God says, don't use finished stone because I don't want it to be about the material. I want it to be about me. And so I don't want you to use finished stone. The Canaanites, they were God's enemy, worshipped idols. And they did so on finished stone. Pagan altars were built with costly items and built high to show off. But God told Israel to build it out of earth. And he did not want them to be distracted from the heart of worship. If an ornate, costly altar was built, one might be tempted to worship it instead of worshiping the God that it was built for. Whew. That sounds similar to what we do in America, isn't it? Right? We build a building, right? We build a stage, right? We build it with nice things, and it becomes all about the building, right? And it doesn't become about the God who we're actually coming to the building to worship, right? And no, you can't touch that because that's the sacred whatever. God told the Israelites, that isn't what I want you to do. I want you to just use simple things because it's not about the altar, it's about the God that you're worshiping. Now, they made those altars for things to be sacrificed upon them. And there were two types of sacrifices that would be made on those altars, one being the burnt offering. And the burnt offering was simply an offering made for atonement for sin. So if there was sin, they would go and they would make the burnt offering. It also dealt with, and then the second peace offering dealt with sin also, but it had a little bit of a different emphasis. These offerings were given on special occasions to give thanks to God, and they symbolized the fellowship that one had with God in recognition of God's reconciliation with the people. And so that offering was not actually consumed with fire, and so they ate the animal that they would presented to God. That was the difference. And so the burnt offering was completely burnt to ashes, and the peace offering was not. But those were the two offerings that took place on the altar that they made. Verse 26. He says, you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness be exposed on it. And that sounds a little weird, doesn't it? Well, the reasoning for this was, again, to distinguish themselves from pagan worship. Ritual nakedness was a feature of the early cults. And in some cults today, that's the case. Whether with fertility cults, their significance, or as an example of extreme religious conservationism. God wanted purity and modesty, and he told his people to avoid going up the steps in order to preserve their modesty. That's simply just men wore robes. Okay? And so the altar was up high, and I don't need to go any further than that. But he was preserving their modesty. Okay? Um, and so these are all the there's many more rules in Leviticus and Numbers, but these are some of the few that God points out to Israel first. And he does this to teach them how to worship. And basically just to point out the fact that I am the reason for the worship, not the materials that I'm asking you to make. Because later on, they're going to build a temple that's going to be full of a lot more precious metals and precious items. And God wants them to understand that I am the one you're worshiping, not the metal itself. So what is our principle here? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to expound on these laws, and then I'm going to give us a principle to how we can apply that today. And so the principle for us today is simply that God is the sole focus of our worship. Okay? When we come to worship God, we come to worship God. Not the things around us, not the people around us, right? God. And so that's the only thing that should matter, is our worship and our focus on God. Second, God continues his list of rules for how the Israelites engage and relate with each other. So he begins by telling them about how to worship. Now he tells them, and all the rest of these to follow, talk about relating with one another. So the second one is the laws pertaining to life. Laws pertaining to life, and that's in chapter 21. We're not going to read that whole thing for sake of time. But he begins speaking about slaves, these laws about slaves. And when we hear the word slaves, we naturally, because of our history of America, we naturally go to the slavery that took place in America. That is not the slavery that he's speaking of here. Okay? The word is slaves, but really it more or less are contract workers. Okay? Now, yes, those contract workers did typically live with the master. They typically were given food by the master, but he also gave them a wage to live off of. In no way were they oppressed like they were here in America. God did not free the Israelites of their oppression to then turn around and oppress others. And so a Hebrew slave was more like an employee, and it was all completely voluntary. They would often volunteer their time to then receive a wage, a house to live in, and food on their plate. Oftentimes, a father would give their daughter, and we'll talk about that in a second, but a father would give their daughter to a master for a specific purpose. We'll get to that in a second. Another distinction between what we know as slavery in America versus Hebrew slaves was the fact that they preserved the family. Oftentimes in slavery in our history in America, they broke the family up. The wife would be over here, the husband would be over here, and the kids would maybe have a completely different master, right? But that isn't what took place in the Hebrew days. In verse 3, it says, "If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him." So if there was a marriage during the contract, verses 4 through 6 explains what's to happen to them. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, "I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free," then his master shall bring him to God, and shall bring him to the door of the doorpost, and this master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and shall be his slave forever. So this was done because the covenant was to be honored in the terms of the 6-year service. So when a slave would come and be a slave to a master, they would have a 6-year contract, and they would serve those 6 years, and then the 7th year they were to be let free. To get out of that contract, if a man were to get married, he could do one of 3 things. He could wait, he could get a job and purchase the freedom of his wife and his kids, or thirdly, he could commit himself to work permanently for the master. And that was the way that they could get out of the contract if they were to get married to a woman within that 6-year period. And simply you may say, well, that's not fair. The point of that is to honor the contract. Okay? In the case of a female slave, remember, women were not necessarily valued in these days, but God valued his daughters highly. There were times when a daughter would have been given to a man for work by her father simply so that she could have a better prospect for marriage. So the father would seek out a master who had wealth and had sons, and he would then give his daughter to that family to be a slave or a worker in hopes that there would be a better prospect for marriage. And the idea was that he would be doing best for his daughter's well-being if he were to do so. And so, so she would be given to the guy. So if she did not do her job well, the master could not just simply sell her to someone else. He's to let her go back free to her own family. If he decides to give her in marriage to his son, he must deal with her as he would deal with his own daughter. Okay? If an engagement happens and the son decides to end the engagement, the man has the duty to make sure that she's still provided for as a wife would be. And then so this is all about slaves, and it's all about how to treat people. Okay? How should we relate with one another? That's God's laws towards slaves. God then continues from specifically the lives of slaves to the lives of every human being. And he touches on a few different things here in this section. Homicide, assault, kidnapping, injuries to humans, and then injuries to animals. We're going to quickly run down through these, okay, for sake of time. But in verses 12 through 14, he addresses homicide. He says, whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, meaning if he didn't do it on purpose, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which you may flee. But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar, and that he may die. So he is in favor of capital punishment for those who take a life of another. The death penalty was invoked, not out of indifference for human life, but rather because each human life matters. Each human life has tremendous value. And we see God values life. He talks about the idea of, later on, he talks about the idea of a woman who is pregnant, is beat, and so the child comes out. God uses that specific situation, right, when he's speaking to him valuing life. God values life. For those who accidentally kill somebody, God says he will provide a place for them to flee. Verse 15 then addresses someone who strikes his parents. He says, whoever strikes his father and mother shall be put to death. This helps to give meaning to honor your father and mother. God highly values the family structure that he has set in place. Father and a mother. A child that strikes their parent is immediately sentenced to death. Verse 16 addresses kidnapping. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. If someone kidnapped somebody else, they were immediately sentenced to death. Verse 17 goes back to the honoring of the parents. Whoever curses the father or his mother shall be put to death. Probably what he's talking about here in verse 17 is not a one-time fit of rage that leads to a child to disrespect their parents, but more to a total repudiation of the authority and failure to care for his parents. Verses 18 through 21 details life-threatening injuries. If one injures another in an argument, they are to pay their missed wages. Seems fair enough, right? Verses 22 to 27 explains if someone severely injured or killed, the punishment should fit the crime. He begins and says, an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? Hand for a hand. He's basically just saying that the punishment should fit the crime. Verses 28 to 32 explains injuries that are associated with animals. If an animal kills a person, that animal is to be killed. We do that today. If it is known to be a vicious animal or has killed someone before and he does it again, the owner is then held liable for negligent homicide because they didn't take care of it to begin with. If it kills a slave, a ransom is then to be paid to the owner of the slave. And so these are all laws that God brings out and teaches these people how to deal with the thing. One of the things I failed to mention at the beginning is the idea of these laws, okay, was they were not always followed to the letter. There was some room for play in there. And so the judge would be the one who would make the final ruling. But these were the laws in which he used to do so. And so the principle, though, for our laws pertaining to life is simply that all life is to be valued. God values life. God values worship. God values life. And so for us as Christians, we ought to stand for life 100% of the time. Starting at conception, ending till we go and see Jesus. We need to stand for life. So he stated laws concerning worship. He stated laws concerning life. Thirdly, he addresses laws concerning others' belongings. And that's in verse 33 down through chapter 22, verse 15. Again, we won't read for sake of time. We read it already, but when there was a wrong done to one's property, one had to pay a restitution. For example, when someone dug a hole and someone else's animal fell into the pit, the owner had to pay to the other owner the money that the animal was worth. Or if one man's animal kills another, they are to pay the owner what it's worth. If someone steals someone's property, like an ox or a sheep, he's to pay what it's worth. Being irresponsible and allowing your animal to destroy another man's property was met with a payment to the owner. And so simply, God cares about others. He cares about the person. And because he cares about the person, he cares about what the person has, right? And so he's telling them that if you destroy somebody else's property, you ought to repay it. And so he tells them these things. In each of these cases, the laws appear to be sensible. Simply, you had to respect somebody else's property, right? So these laws were wonderful gifts because they showed people how to live in community, loving their neighbors as themselves, which is one of the commands that Jesus gave to us. So simply, the principle here is to go above and beyond to serve and generously, right? If you make a mistake and you hurt somebody else, go above and beyond to make it right. Oftentimes, God says to pay back 5 times what it's worth. He mentions that in this passage as well. So go above and beyond to serve generously. God spoke of the laws pertaining to worship, life, others' belongings. Next, he hits on this idea of holiness in chapter 22, verse 16 to 20. It says, if a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Whoever lies with an animal shall be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. And he's talking about this idea of holiness and purity. Verses 16 and 17 are obviously concerning sex outside of marriage. And a man who convinces a young woman to have sex with him, he is to make it right by taking her as his wife and by providing for her as he would his own wife, as well as pay the father what was required. So if the father refused to give her to him, though, he was still to pay the money regardless. God then declares in verse 18 that a sorceress was to be put to death. And someone that lied with an animal in verse 19 was also to be put to death, as well as someone who sacrifices to other gods. God values purity. God values holiness. And so he makes these laws regarding such. And so the principle here is simply purity and holiness should be valued, right? We should value purity. We should value holiness. And for some reason, well, I know the reason, sin, our people have lost that mindset. Actually, it's the other way around, right? Debauchery and filth and immorality is what is valued in our culture today, not purity and holiness. Someone who tries to keep themselves pure and keep themselves holy is ridiculed in our culture today. But we ought to value what God values, and God values holiness. So he speaks to these laws pertaining worship. He speaks to these laws pertaining life, property of others, and holiness. And next he talks about the laws pertaining to social justice. And for sake of time, again, we won't go through all of those because we have already, but they were to be a people of compassion, a people of love, and a people of grace. And they were to have compassion on the foreigner. He says that in verse 21. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. He's saying, you know what it was like to be a foreigner. You know what it was like to be somebody who was a stranger in the land in which you live. So don't treat others with disrespect because they're foreigners. He tells them to have compassion on the widow. He tells them to have compassion on the orphan. He then says if they mistreat any of those groups, his wrath would be kindled and they would be killed. Why? Because God expects for us to care for those in need, because he cared for us when we were in desperate need of salvation. Those who know such love should be the very ones showing it to this broken world. Verses 25 to 27, he says he wants them to have compassion on the poor. He says if you lend money to the poor, don't expect it back. Don't exact interest from these people when you give them money. If there's a homeless person on the street, you decide to give them money, just give them the money. Don't give them an IOU, right? Or don't expect an IOU in return. The last few verses of the chapter, he then rifles off a few different things pertaining to this topic. He speaks about honoring God and those in leadership. He speaks to the idea of giving him the things that belong to him, and then he follows up with this idea of consecrating yourselves to him or making yourselves pure, right, when standing before a perfect and holy God. And he closes the section speaking to this idea of not perverting justice, not standing in the way of justice by spreading a false report. And again, he's kind of hitting on the one of the Ten Commandments there. So don't pervert justice. The principle here is to take care of the poor and needy. So God speaks to worship, life, others' belongings, holiness, social justice, and then he finally closes with laws pertaining to the observances. The observances. And so the purpose here is to observe and remember what God has done for his people. And so he opens with worship and he closes with worship. He speaks here to 4 different observances of remembrance. The first one, in verses 10 through 13, he speaks to observing the Sabbath, or an idea of rest. He then tells them in verses 19 through or 14 to 19 to observe the 3 feasts: the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Harvest, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And so these 3 major feasts were rich in their teaching about salvation. Jesus Christ is the Savior God, always planned to send. And so already in the Old Testament, he's giving his people the experiences that would help them understand the meaning of their salvation. Jesus is the source of our sanctification, the first fruits of our resurrection, and the Lord of our harvest, the water of life, and the sacrifice for our sin. And that's what each of those harvests or those feasts represent. And so he wants them to observe the Sabbath, and he wants them to observe those 3 feasts. So what's the principle here? Simply put, setting aside time devoted to remember what has been done for you as a child of God. We ought to set aside time to devote ourselves to remembering what God has done for us. That is what we do on Sunday mornings. That's what we do when we come together for Bible studies. That's what we do when our family gets together for devotions. That's what time you should do when you take devotions for yourself in the morning and the evening, whenever you decide to take time for devotion for yourself, is so that we can observe and remember what God has done for us. That's what God put in place these 4 observances for in the Old Testament. And the principle that we as the New Testament saints can take is that we ought to set aside time, right, to remember and to observe what God has done for us in whatever time we decide to do so. Also, He's set time for communion. One of the ordinances of the local church is simply put for that, so that we can observe and remember what it is that God has done for us. Remembrance is a theme all throughout Scripture, right? Remembering what it is that God has done for you and for me. Now, again, we went through each of those laws. Some of them we went through a lot faster than the others, right? Because I think it is that, not that none of them aren't important, but I do believe that worship is of the most priority, right? And then God values life. He values others. He values holiness, social justice, and then He obviously values observances or remembrances. But what do we do with all of that? And so this is the so what portion of our message, is the application side of it. We hit on some of that with those principles that we talked about, and I can go through those principles again for you if you'd like. Starting with worship. God is the sole focus of our worship. And so therefore, we should worship God and God alone. Secondly, is the fact that we need to, that God values life. And so all life should be valued. God values others, and so we should go above and beyond to serve others. God values holiness, and so purity and holiness are to be prioritized in our lives. Social justice, God values justice, and so we should take care of the poor and the needy, and God values the observances or the remembrances, and so we should value setting aside time to devote ourselves to remembering what it is that has been done for you as a child of God. So what? What is the application? After looking at these laws given to the nation of Israel, what is our takeaway today as the New Testament church? The first thing is simply that we are to value what God values. We are to value what God values. And then secondly, when we value what God values, we glorify God, we love others, and in turn we reflect the character of God to the creation of God. We talked a couple weeks about what was Israel's purpose. It was to reflect the character of God to the Gentile people. Our purpose today as the New Testament church is to reflect the character of God to those around us. And so when we value what God values, we glorify God. When we value what God values, we love others. And in doing so, we reflect the character of God to the creation of God. And that's our purpose, church. I talked earlier about the gospel. We were saved not just from something, but to something. My wife and I were talking about this week, right? We were saved from hell, yes. Praise God. Hallelujah, right? But we were also saved to something, and that is to worship and serve a most precious and holy God. And we do so by valuing what God values. We can take these laws and we can learn from these laws. And you may say, look at some of them and say, Pastor, some of those are harsh. Yes, but it's because God values something. God values life, and so the consequence for taking a life is high because God values it. God values worship. So the laws pertaining to worship are going to be ones that are going to be hard to accomplish because He values it. God values you. And so the consequence for that was Him sending His Son. Sending His Son so that He could go to the cross, so that He could bear the weight and sin of the world and die a sinner's death, put in a grave for 3 days, raise again so that He can conquer sin and death, all because God values you. God values you, church. We ought to value what God values. And in doing so, we will begin to worship Him. We will begin to glorify Him in a greater way. we will begin to love others in a greater way, and in doing so reflect the character of God to those around us. Let's close in a word.